Someone needs to tell the people who block traffic in the name of a cause, no one likes you, and you're probably hurting your cause. In case you haven't seen what's going on lately, activists for ending the war in Gaza have taken to gathering on roads and bridges and stopping commuters from crossing. It happened last week in New York and San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle. They also blocked traffic here on the 405, but no one noticed. What they did notice was this, that you have to be pretty dumb to think that the way to bring people around to your point of view is to make them late to pick up their kids from daycare. And that's what most normies are thinking. I have a kid. I have a job, and yes, I'm sure there are injustices on both sides in the Middle East, as there are injustices all over the world, but I'm going to be late for work, something you protesters on the bridge seem to have the luxury of not having to worry about, which seems...
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, May the 4th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the Patriotic Song of the Day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, and Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 Strategies of War, plus the enemies of my country. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. And now for our Australian listeners.
There's an old Australian stockman lying, dying. And he gets himself up onto one elbow and he turns to his mates who are gathered round and he says, "Watch me wallabies feed, mate. Watch me wallabies feed. They're a dangerous breed, mate. So watch me wallabies feed. All together now, tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. Tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. Keep me cockatoo cool, curl. Keep me cockatoo cool. Oh, don't go acting the fool, curl. Just keep me cockatoo cool. All together now, tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. Tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. And take me koala back, Jack. Take me koala back. He lives somewhere out on the track, Mac. So take me koala back. All together now, tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. Tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. And mind me platypus duck, Bill. Mind me platypus duck. Oh, don't let him go running amok, Bill. Just mind me platypus duck. All together now, tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. Tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. Play your didgeridoo, blue. Play your didgeridoo. Oh, like, keep playing till I shoot through, blue. Play your didgeridoo. All together now, tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. Tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. Tan me hide when I'm dead, Fred. Tan me hide when I'm dead. So we tanned his hide when he died, Clyde, and that's it hanging on the shed. All together now, tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down. Tie me kangaroo down, sport. Tie me kangaroo down.
And that was Walt Harris. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Creativity is the foundation of wealth. All progress comes from the creative minority. Under capitalism, wealth is less a stock of goods than a flow of ideas, the defining characteristic of which is surprise. If it were not surprising, we could plan it, and socialism would work. George Gilder. Human action always includes surprise. This is true in the very nature of things. This element of surprise is not only where human creativity can shine, but it is a large part of the doomed-to-fail nature of collectivism. Deep central planning cannot take into account the creative capacity of human beings. It will always play catch-up.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
Rule number 3. The culture is the message, so seize it. This is crucial. Accept the fact that the culture, by which of course I mean us, is never going to reflect your version of reality until you change it from within. Our infiltration and takeover of the narrative has been going on since the 1960s, and reversing it is no small task. If you're looking for acceptance, or worse, love from the mainstream media, your old college professor, or Hollywood, forget about it. This is a war you've long ago lost, but which you can still win if you choose to fight it. But the first step in fighting lies in picking up an weapon and choosing to use it. So until you do that, buddy, you are standing there as bare-assed as Mel Gibson and his band of Scottish merry men in Braveheart. And look how far they got. Well, okay, so they got further than Longshanks and the English would have thought, given their lack of underwear and their reliance on rusty old swords and blue face paint. And in the end, Mel got what he wanted, namely, being disemboweled in front of a cheering audience, while Sophie Marceau wept. So it all ended happily ever after all, and Mel lived on to direct Jesus at Golgotha. But you lot are neither crazy Celtic warriors, nor six-packed Spartans spoiling for a fight with Brazilian drag queens. Exalted rulers of the Persian Empire. So you're going to need a little something more in the way of armaments in order to win your battles. The culture is where the action is, and it's high time you folks started battling for the high ground. You know, the redoubt from which your archers can launch their arrows. The place from which your castle defenders can pour down vats of boiling oil on our heads. Just as we do to you every week, from the pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, all 3 broadcast networks, Time, Newsweek, and 2 of the 3 cable news channels. And yet, as we've seen, it's a battlefield you've almost completely abandoned, and instead left to us. Where armies of the night once clashed, today only the lonely crows flap about in search of fresh eyeballs to pick. Why, there hasn't been a good Armageddon in these precincts since, well, the last Armageddon. And that was back in the days when Egyptians, Assyrians, and Babylonians roamed the earth. So it's long past high time you picked up your stubby little sword, checked to see that you're packing what every self-respecting Scotsman packs under his kilt, and got on with the party. So what do? Let's take your objectives one at a time. Corollary number 1, get back in the media game. And how do you do that? Simple. Start by taking your media back. Let's face it, at this point, the U.S. is pretty much a banana republic, riven by 2 factions that are not quite in numerical equilibrium, which is a fancy way of saying that there are more of you than there are of us. Always have been. But by using our pet media as a kind of kinescope, the illusion of an illusion, we have been able to fool you throughout the last century into believing that we have both right and might on our side. On the one side are you, the revanchist, clinging desperately to your faith and your guns and your charming belief in your cherished Constitution. While on the other is us, revolutionary, amoral, and wanting nothing more than the complete destruction and remaking of your country, a mote in our eyes since its inception, in the egalitarian collectivist mode, which, after all, only fulfills the prescriptions inherent in your Declaration and constitutional preamble. From the shining city on a hill to Satan's throne of royal slate, of which Milton sang. That's the descent we have outlined for you. Forget about the New York Times and the legacy dinosaurs still lumbering along 6th Avenue in New York City. At least until you follow my advice and take them over. Good Gaia, Time used to be the flagship publication of that noted right-wing nut, Henry Luce. and somehow we managed to change it, mostly through our Harvard degrees and our Rhodes scholarships, which I gather from old-time hands. They used to dispense along with the free booze in the corridors of the Time and Life building across 6th Avenue from the real Rockefeller Center on Thursday and Friday nights as the magazine went to press. Some of them may stumble around for a while, but in the end, unless they change their business models and give up their lavish Harvard expectation lifestyles, the 12-room apartments on Central Park West, the houses in the Hamptons, the European vacations, they are looking at the last rites very soon. The action has moved elsewhere. A few years ago, the conventional wisdom was that newspapers would be around forever. Where else could you find such a compelling and timely package of information, conveniently printed on the finest fish wrap, that gathered all of the important events of the day and delivered them right to your doorstep? Then the internet came along, with its near instantaneous delivery of news and content that people might actually want to read.
And that was part 1 of chapter 22 of Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Rules for Retrogrades, Rule 39.
Rule 39. The retrograde rejects any and all racist, statist, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic perversions of conservatism associated with the alt-right. Alt-right is non-right. It is false conservatism, ideological refuse to be identified, decried, and jettisoned. Intellectually, the alt-right worldview proves to be piffle, falderall, without pedigree. But practically, as a stalking horse in the popular mind for Catholic conservatism, it presents the mortal danger of mistaken identity. The radical news and commentary media will hasten to identify retrogrades as alt-right because they customarily slander all non-moderate, non-tepid opposition parties in this boilerplate fashion. It is the new standard of radical Western journalism to depict any and all parties rejecting one world government and instead espousing national sovereignty as alt-right. Simply put, to be retrograde is to pose a superlative threat to the radical mainstream. We are the one true movement of classical anti-racism and anti-bigotry. Radicals will never be deterred from their calumnious false narrative by hard facts, however. The retrograde worldview insists on patriotism, borders, and turning back the clock for a highly specific reason: love of Christ and his moral code. The alt-right worldview merely apes these sympathies from a tawdry resentment for the Christian teleology which insinuates them. These alt-right rogues can easily be popularly confused for retrogrades because they customarily fight nuclear, like retrogrades. Like that of the retrogrades, alt-right rhetoric lacks the doddering domestic impotence of the mod cons. The alt-right is possessed of some fire in the belly, which makes it stand out amongst moderate mainstream wordplay, but their wicked principles are basically diametrically opposed to ours. The real secret behind the radical rush to characterize alt-right as conservatism inheres in the fact that alt-right is actually nothing more than the anti-globalist alt-left. Both rivals of the retrograde, radicals and alt-right, prove to be materialistic egalitarians who favor mob-rule democratic institutions which reject the timelessness of the immutable natural law and the dignity of the individual. Consider the identical nature of the radical left and the alt-right on the following substantial issues. They both favor centrally planned socialist economy. They both fixate on a determinist view of race and personal identity, whereas the retrograde adopts a position of Thomistic, colorblind individualism. They both harbor a cultural and policy antipathy to Christianity and a longing for a robust and binding surrogate for it. Each side cherishes abortion, population control, and eugenics. Moreover, modern radicalism is often implicitly neo-pagan, whereas the alt-right is explicitly neo-pagan. Consider this passage from an article in Vice. Quote, "There's a war going on in the American pagan community. On one side are racists who see gods like Odin and Thor as an embodiment of the supremacy whites have over the rest of the planet. On the other are the practitioners who believe these gods transcend racial lines and belong to everyone. Recently, the contention between these two groups has reached a tipping point as anti-racist pagans try to claim the narrative around their faith before it is overtaken by alt-right racists. Although the leaders of Nazi Germany were obsessed with paganism and the occult, it has largely been associated with multiculturalism here in the United States." Unquote. Like all paganism, all bigotry, all eugenics, all anti-Christianity, all collectivism, alt-right is to be repudiated wherever the retrograde encounters it, which is practically nowhere except on the internet, given the alt-right's exaggerated yet small presence in American life.
And that was Rule 39 from Rules for Retrogrades 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left from Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
Since conservatives have spent a generation retreating from the arena of ideas to form holy huddles in our own little enclaves of the already initiated, we have forsaken an entire generation to be indoctrinated by anti-American, anti-Christian leftists who clearly know what they're doing. The emerging generation hasn't rejected the American way because it hasn't even considered it. We've stopped competing in the arena of ideas, so we've left them with no choice but to accept the synthesized narrative, or the Hegelian dialectic, that they have been sold in government schools. Thus, they believe the Constitution calls for the separation of church and state, there is no such thing as transcendent truth, and moral absolutes don't exist. So if we're going to engage this emerging generation, we're going to have to define our terms and ourselves clearly and explicitly. If there's one of our tactics that needs a complete overhaul, it is this one. We're still speaking Betamax VHS, and the culture, especially the emerging generation, is speaking Blu-ray. One of the best books on this subject I've ever read is Beyond Belief to Conviction by Josh McDowell. McDowell talks about how terms that used to have a consensus definition in past generations now mean totally different things. The best example is the term tolerance. Tolerance used to mean, hey, I may not agree with you and what you're doing or what you believe, but as long as you're not doing anything illegal and your business stays your business, then it's no business of mine. But now tolerance means you must accept, validate, and then participate in everything I am doing that is not illegal, and not only must it be your business, but your children's business as well. That's just one example of how we have lost the language here. In this media-driven age of mass communication and social networking, he who controls the language has control. Even our attempts to combat this have been ineffective. For instance, in a misguided attempt to appear culturally relevant and sensitive, the past generation of conservative leaders created their own code words like traditional values to avoid saying Judeo-Christian or biblical. In other words, they redefined their terms to appease their enemies. Ironically, these code words are actually more offensive than the real words. When I tell someone I am taking this stand because I am a Christian, they may not agree, but since they're usually not a Christian, they at least understand that disagreement is coming from my bitter clinging to my guns and my religion. However, if I tell them I'm taking this stand because I'm for traditional values, I just told them they have no values or that their values are out of the mainstream when the mainstream is currently preaching their values. Therefore, my attempt to soften the blow just created more enmity instead. Good luck finding common ground or bringing them over to your side from there. What I have found when interacting with those who don't share my worldview is the exact opposite is true. The more I clearly define what I believe and why I believe it, the more credibility I develop with them, and the more willing they are to engage me in the arena of ideas, provided I do one thing. I must apply my standard consistently. Let me repeat that for emphasis. We must apply our standard consistently. Translation: The Bible and the Constitution must be equally applied to Democrats and Republicans. Since we are no longer a silent majority in this country, we cannot just continue to subjectively admonish Democrats and provide Republicans political exoneration for their violation of the laws of nature and nature's God and expect to get our way on Election Day. In this next phase of the culture war, we're going to need converts to our side. And in this day and age, no one wants to sign up with a bunch of hypocrites. If we want the culture at large to accept our truth claims, then we must have integrity in applying them. I define integrity as a consistency between right belief and right behavior, or long obedience in the right direction. Without integrity, there is no trust. Without trust, there is no relationship. Without relationship, there is no hope of getting others to see things your way. As the old saying goes, no one cares what you know until they know how much you care. The American people don't believe that we really believe these principles like limited government and Judeo-Christian morality that we're clamoring for all the time because they see our unwillingness to hold Republicans to the same standard as Democrats. They think all we care about is beating Democrats and not what's best for the country.
And that was the next part of Chapter 10 from Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the Daily Dad for May the 4th.
May 4th. You have to teach your kid these 4 virtues.
If at some point in your life you should come across anything better than justice, truth, self-control, courage, it must be an extraordinary thing indeed. Marcus Aurelius.
Aristotle worshipped them, the Christians and the Stoics too. In the West, we call them the cardinal virtues from the Latin word cardo, which means hinge. These are the virtues upon which the good life hinges. These are the virtues that every parent is obligated to teach their children. Courage, to stand up, to charge ahead, to not be afraid or timid in life. Moderation, to know balance, to be in control of oneself, to avoid excess or extremes. Justice, to do the right thing, to care for others, to do your duty. Wisdom, to learn, to study, to keep an open mind. These are the 4 essential tenets for living. As a parent, you must worship these virtues and raise kids who do the same. You have to model these virtues and teach them by example and by instruction how they can too. Their life and the future hinges on it.
And that was the Daily Dad for May 4th. You have to teach your kids these 4 things by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, instead of Bishop Barron, I'm going to play a little bit of Father Michael Rossman and from the Daily Jesuit, and it's called Avoid the Living Dead.
In Christus Vivit, Pope Francis writes, "Avoid the paralysis of the living dead, who have no life because they are afraid to take risks." I don't think the Pope is telling us to abandon our family members who aren't sufficiently risk-taking, nor is he making a statement on the existence of zombies. But Pope Francis identifies how we are influenced by others. If the people around us are not striving to do something great with their lives, that paralysis can infect us. But if the people in our lives are seeking holiness, that also influences us. Jim Rohn famously stated, "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." You see much evidence for this in the history of the Church. Saints tend to develop in clusters. Francis and Clare, Augustine and Monica, Ignatius, Francis Xavier, and Peter Faber. So hang out with the living dead and become a zombie, or walk with the wise and become wise.
And that was Father Michael Rossman. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand Thought of the Day.
So long as the moral cannibalism of the altruist code permits people to believe that it is virtuous and right to sacrifice some men for the sake of others, they will reject capitalism as a system of selfish greed, and they will cling to totalitarian statism of one kind or another, either communist or fascist or Nazi or socialist or welfare. So long as men...
And that was the Ayn Rand Thought of the Day. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, you need to vote Republican and become a Republican, because President Biden is not only the face of the country, the leader of the country, but he is the titular head of the Democrat Party. And what he does reflects on the Democrat Party and everybody in it. So right now, the Democrat Party is a party that wanders around not knowing where it's going, what it's doing, or what it's saying. It is brain-addled. And you, as a voter, deserve better. That's why you need to vote Republican. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now we pick up where we left off with the 33 strategies of war.
This has great relevance to all forms of conflict. When your enemies try to present themselves as more justified than you are, and therefore more moral, you must see this move for what it most often is. Not a reflection of morality, of right and wrong, but a clever strategy, an exterior maneuver. You can recognize an exterior maneuver in a number of ways. First, the moral attack often comes out of left field, having nothing to do with what you imagine the conflict is about. Something you have done in a completely different arena is dredged up as a way to drain your support or inject you with guilt. Second, the attack is often ad hominem. Rational argument is met with the emotional and personal. Your character, rather than the issue you are fighting over, becomes the ground of the debate. Your motives are questioned and given the darkest turn. Once you realize you are under attack by a moral warrior using the exterior maneuver, it is vital to keep control of your emotions. If you complain or lash out angrily, you just look defensive, as if you had something to hide. The moral warrior is being strategic. The only effective response is to be strategic too. Even if you know that your cause is just, you can never assume that the public sees it the same way. Appearances and reputation rule in today's world. Letting the enemy frame these things to its liking is akin to letting it take the most favorable position on the battlefield. Once the fight for moral terrain has begun, you must fight to occupy the high ground in the same way you would in a shooting war. Like any form of warfare, moral conflict has both offensive and defensive possibilities. When you are on the offense, you are actively working to destroy the enemy's reputation. Before and during the American Revolution, the great propagandist Samuel Adams took aim at England's reputation for being fair-minded, liberal, and civilized. He poked holes in this moral image by publicizing England's exploitation of the colonies' resources and simultaneous exclusion of their people from democratic processes. The colonists had had a high opinion of the English, but not after Adams's relentless campaign. To succeed, Adams had to resort to exaggeration, picking out and emphasizing the cases in which the English were heavy-handed. His was not a balanced picture. He ignored the ways in which the English had treated the colonies rather well. His goal was not to be fair, but to spark a war, and he knew that the colonists would not fight unless they saw the war as just and the British as evil. In working to spoil your enemy's moral reputation, do not be subtle. Make your language and distinctions of good and evil as strong as possible. Speak in terms of black and white. It is hard to get people to fight for a gray area. Revealing your opponent's hypocrisies is perhaps the most lethal offensive weapon in the moral arsenal. People naturally hate hypocrites. This will work, however, only if the hypocrisy runs deep. It has to show up in their values. Few will care about some innocuous, self-contradictory comment made or vote taken long ago. But enemies who trumpet certain values as inherent to their side, yet who do not always adhere to those values in reality, make juicy targets. The Algerian and North Vietnamese propaganda campaigns were so destructive in part because of the discrepancy they were able to show between the values of freedom and liberty espoused by France and the United States, and the actions those countries were taking to squash national independence movements. Both nations seemed hypocritical. If a fight with your enemies is inevitable, always work to make them start it. In 1861, President Abraham Lincoln maneuvered carefully to make the South shoot first at Fort Sumter, initiating the Civil War. That put Lincoln on the moral high ground and won over many ambivalent Northerners to his side. Similarly, even if you are fighting a war of aggression, your goal to take from your enemy, find a way to present yourself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. You are fighting not for land or money, but to free people suffering under an oppressive regime. In general, in a conflict that is potentially nasty, in which you are certain the enemy will resort to almost anything, it is best that you go on the offensive with your moral campaign and not wait for their attacks. Poking holes in the other side's reputation is easier than defending your own. The more you stay on the offensive, the more you can distract the public from your own deficiencies and faults are inevitable in war. If you are physically and militarily weaker than your enemy, all the more reason to mount an exterior maneuver. Move the battle to the moral terrain, where you can hamstring and beat a stronger foe.
And that was the next part of Chapter 25, Occupy the Moral High Ground, from The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, how to block brainwashing, from a little section from Moral Prompts to One's Doom. And the author says, quote, I will deal with the myth of wokeism now. It is simply pro-corporate pseudo-leftism. It actually has more in common with classical fascism. It is a fascism that uses communist methodology. It is an ad hoc potpourri of trite New Age flim-flam, cod socialism, Pythagoreanisms, commercialized paganism, the Process Church, a breakaway group from Scientology based in England, a smattering of Pop LaVey Satanism, and the sort of trite British spy Aleister Crowley was dishing up over 100 years ago, unquote. And that was a section from How to Block Brainwashing by the Rogue Hypnotist. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we're going to pick up where we left off on Chapter 60 of The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper.
But even with Worthy's uncanny reflexes, he feared it wouldn't be enough. These men weren't restrained to any logic of fire and maneuver, instead scrambling toward him across abundant covered positions provided by the processing equipment. They appeared to be a mix of Caucasians, Chinese, and Arabs. Some were wild-eyed, others calm and shouting to one another, and a few sounded the shrill battle cries of men who'd long since resigned themselves to dying inside this building. Worthy and David couldn't make a move for the door without getting shot, and while Cancer and Riley were surely moving toward the sound of gunfire as quickly as they could, he intuitively knew they couldn't possibly make it in time to alter the outcome of what was now occurring. David's voice transmitted over his earpiece. Cancer, Team 1 pinned down and in need of support. Race gun, assault forward. Worthy realized what his team leader meant. David was trapped behind the wall-mounted conveyor belt, unable to move against the sprays of sparking metal as bullets impacted his covered position. Worthy, by contrast, could dart out from either side of the rolling cabinet he was braced behind, and he had a good idea for his next covered firing position.
He laid down some suppressing fire first, barely registering Cancer's transmission of Team 2 moving. Worthy utilized one side of the cabinet as cover to unleash blasts of gunfire against every known and suspected enemy position. Emptying his magazine, he tucked himself behind the cabinet for the last time and conducted a reload. Then he spun out from the opposite side, crouching low as he took 5 charging steps that sent him slamming against the side of the forklift. Taking aim from one side, he saw a new universe of firing angles, the now exposed flanks of 2 men who'd previously been hidden from view. Worthy decimated them both with a 10-round volley, their bodies dropping as he ducked behind the forklift, then popped out the other side to sling lead at a partially visible man trying to locate him. David exploited the surprise to maneuver forward, his figure a flash of movement in Worthy's peripheral vision. By the time the first bullets began clanging against the forklift, David was behind cover, engaging the shooter with 2 suppressed bursts. The incoming fire against the forklift ended, though he could still hear pop shots from a single shooter coming from deeper in the room. Unable to locate the man, Worthy decided to do something that would either prove very brilliant or very dumb within the next 3 seconds. He climbed atop the forklift, squeezing his body against the seat to gain an elevated vantage point with the faith that his reflexes would outpace the enemy's. The next milliseconds unfolded with excruciating slowness. He saw the last visible fighter braced behind a stacked pallet, a white man who swung his rifle from David toward the new flash of movement. Worthy tried to align his sights, the effort ending as his suppressor struck a metal roof bracket on the forklift. He leaned back to clear the obstruction, then thrust the buttstock back against his shoulder as he took aim in time to see a single muzzle flash from his opponent. Firing at the same instant, Worthy saw the man's throat explode in a burst of red as he fell out of sight. The enemy had missed his shot, and Worthy hadn't, though the victory seemed of precious little consolation at present. David transmitted, "Team 2, wave off, we're good. Exfil, exfil, exfil." The response came in the form of a deep, thundering blast that shook the entire building. The overhead lights flickered, and David was transmitting as the echo receded. "Team 2, status." He got his answer not in the form of a transmitted response. There was none, but in the sounds of unsuppressed gunfire that followed from deeper in the building. No words needed to be spoken after that. David and Worthy were sprinting past the enemy bodies, hoping none had survived with the wherewithal to take aim as they made their way toward a new gunfight. Unaware of his orientation in time and space, Riley fought through a fog of consciousness to try and determine what in the hell had just happened. The last thing he remembered was advancing through the building with Cancer, trying to make their way to the gunfight that had obviously ensnared David and Worthy. He had 1 second, maybe 2, of trying to determine the source of a new noise, one that he concluded to be running footsteps, and by the time he and Cancer were opening fire on a man in the doorway, the explosion had erased the world from view. The facility seemed to vanish in a cloud of plaster dust and smoke, a stinking mist of high explosives and human flesh that sent hundreds of steel ball bearings into flight and turning the room into a pinball machine of destruction. Now that he was regaining his vision, Riley saw the industrial ceiling lined with snaking pipes and ultraviolet bulbs that flickered with flashes of light that sent spikes of pain to the back of his skull. He was flat on his back, unable to summon the requisite strength and coordination to move his limbs. Glancing down, he saw a row of bloody dots stitching his left arm. Ball bearings from the suicide vest embedded in his flesh, though that was the least of his worries. The blasts of automatic gunfire sounded distant through his ringing head, growing louder and clearer as he regained his wits. The incoming gunfire and ricochets created a hailstorm of bullets that zipped and spun through the air around him, an angry hornet swarm of metal clanging off every hard surface. Groggily looking sideways, Riley felt for the rifle slung across his shoulders, detecting it through the gloved palm of his numb right hand. He struggled to lift it across his chest, the effort requiring the sum total of all his focus and strength. The enemy was moving into the room, trying to find him and Cancer through the smoke, shouting to each other and firing indiscriminately. This wasn't going to end well, Riley knew at once, though he couldn't seem to make his body move fast enough to respond. Hell of a way to go, he thought. After all the physical and tactical training, all the deployments and gunfights, he was powerless to intervene in his fate thanks to some asshole clacking off a suicide vest. As he struggled to lift his assault rifle to defend himself, Riley caught a flash of movement from a doorway to his side. He wanted to shoot, couldn't orient his weapon, and then saw that the man now entering wasn't an enemy fighter, but his salvation. David sped through the door, cutting right and out of Riley's view before a second man entered. Thank God, Riley thought. The figure blazing through the doorway at the speed of light was Worthy, descending from on high and shooting with a speed that Riley had never witnessed before, on the range or otherwise. Worthy's rifle went empty, and rather than spend the second it took him to reload his magazine, he dropped his rifle and drew his pistol instead, taking aim and resuming fire by the time his primary weapon had fallen on its sling. But then his pistol went empty too, slide locking to the rear as a wounded Chinese fighter fell to the floor in Riley's view. The downed fighter locked eyes with him, then shifted his rifle for a final kill shot against the disoriented medic. Before he could pull the trigger, a spray of bullet impacts stitched across the man's side and he collapsed dead, David appearing over his body a second later and shouting, "Clear!" Then it was over. No more gunfire, no enemy shouts, just the ringing in Riley's ears from the blast before David moved to help, straining to lift him to his feet. Riley aided the effort as best he could, feeling strength return to his legs as he stood shakily, looking for cancer in the room's smoldering interior. He located his teammate a second later. Cancer had apparently fared better in the blast and was already standing under his own power, though bleeding from his right thigh in what appeared to be a wound from the suicide vest. "Exfil," David announced. "Let's get the fuck out of here." 61. In the seconds before David called, Ian committed fully to his plan. He was the only team member with any semblance of rationality remaining, untainted by the overwhelming exhilaration of combat and the most emotionally distanced from the situation at hand. The rest were biased, not only by sheer virtue of experience with near-death scenarios, but by following a single leader who was quickly turning into a madman, if he hadn't already. After a full night of running from the cops, David was deliriously sleep-deprived and running off fumes of rage and hatred. Ian considered his response to a request for living detainees. Some people just need to get shot in the fucking face, and then allowed that his team leader may have been losing his mind as well. Ian had increasingly gotten the sense that David's marital situation had grown more tenuous, and that wasn't a recipe for mental health when his primary inputs were combat action and fighting for his life. All that added up to Ian's second greatest concern at present, landing just shy of a successful terrorist attack. David was a charismatic young leader, intent on accomplishing his personal mission at all costs, and he'd take his entire team and the agency's long overdue reincarnation of a targeted killing program off the cliff edge along with himself. When David finally called, Ian answered on the first ring. His team leader's voice was contemptuous. "Your brilliant idea was one giant trap. We barely made it out. 2 of us are wounded, we're low on ammo and down to 1 car. So thanks for that." "I tried calling you off," Ian shot back. "A delivery truck left the objective as you guys were closing in." "You have eyes on?" "I have an idea based on intermittent surveillance footage. Get going northbound on US Highway 1. "We're on the move," David confirmed, "and you better not lose sight of the truck before Duchess finds out." "She knows," Ian replied at once. "She... what? How?" "I called her." "Why would you do that, Ian?" "I couldn't call you off, and the Ruckus have to be on board that truck. Don't be an asshole." "It's my nature," David almost shouted, the sound of a car accelerating audible on the other end. "So I suppose our route is crawling with cops, isn't it?" "Yeah, probably." "Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Ian." "Don't blame me for the comms relay going down," Ian said. "If you want to get your head out of your ass for 1 second, there's more." "Yeah? What's that?" "My last visual on the delivery truck was at a traffic cam on Olive Chapel Road. It should have passed my next camera angle of the road at Alden Bridge, but it hasn't." "Great. So what's in between the two?" "That's my point. There's a single paved eastbound route called Portofino. So the truck must have taken it, but all it leads to are a few neighborhoods and businesses that I can't find any connection between. No suspicious side roads, tunnel entrances, nothing. The truck didn't break brush to drive into the river, so there must be a concealed trail or enemy facility. Maybe a cache. We've got precious little to lose by searching that road for anything suspicious. Except our lives." Well, yeah, Ian said, except for that. Get moving and search for some vehicle outlet constructed since the satellite imagery was updated. You've got a 1-minute head start. A 1-minute head start to find a needle in a haystack. You're just full of good fucking news, aren't you? Well, I have to tell you, David cut him off. Head start against what? And do I want to know why I only have 1 minute? Ian swallowed. Because that's how long it will take me to reach Duchess. Don't you dare. Make no mistake, David, Ian said. I absolutely dare. Stopping this attack is more important than who gets the credit. The only reason I'm calling you first is that the cops are tied up at the seafood distribution facility. And if you can find the truck before they do, then maybe, just maybe, we'll score enough credibility not to rot in jail for the rest of our natural lives. So don't fuck this up. 62. Riding in the passenger seat, I braced myself as subtly as I could, cringing in mild anticipation of a crash as the trees whipped past the glow of our headlights on either side of the road. I said nothing, however, trying not to project any weakness to Worthy, who was negotiating the winding forest curves as quickly as our vehicle and his reflexes would allow. Which, considering it was Worthy, turned out to be pretty fucking fast. From the back seat, Riley said, 2 miles of road remaining before the dead end. Next street to our left is a subdivision. Holding a phone in his right hand, Riley was ticking off road junctures on the satellite imagery that Ian had sent us as we searched for some vehicle pathway that had been constructed in the interim. His left arm was out of action, wrapped in pressure dressings, and hastily tied in a field sling. Pass, I said. Let the cops search it. We're looking for a Hail Mary. The neighborhood entrance passed in a blur outside the window, and Worthy whipped the vehicle at near minimum traction around another bend in the road. From the seat behind me, Cancer said, "We ain't catching a Hail Mary if you roll us into the trees at 50 miles per hour. Cancer had absorbed 4 ball bearings from the suicide bomber and wore a pressure dressing on his right thigh as a result. I could hear the pain in his voice as he added, "And try to remember this is our last car." "Last car?" Worthy asked. "Or last chance?" "Either. Both." He was right on both counts, of course. We'd used 2 cars in our hasty raid of the seafood distribution plant, though since we'd been required to exit the premises in a considerably more rushed fashion than we'd entered, one of those cars remained parked outside the building. Worthy responded, "Never thought the mission would end like this. Clown car of hell-bent men barreling toward a target that might not be there." Riley added, "Decent band name, though. Clown car of hell-bent men. We'll have to start that up when we get back." "If we get back," I corrected him, because not even Ian knew what he was sending us to, and it was quite possible that he was wrong, that he'd simply missed some camera angle showing the delivery truck escaping from some alternate path. But at this point, there was nothing else to go on, nothing of value on this stretch of road that was quickly ending. Worthy offered, "Maybe they saw us coming and our raid flushed the truck out." "Not a chance," I said. "Whatever Bari Khan is doing is part of the plan he's had since Syria. We're the ones improvising, not him." But at this point, what did it matter? The abandoned team car outside the seafood facility was full of our fingerprints, with stray hair for the police to cross-check with DNA samples that Duchess was probably providing them at that very moment. Riley's injury had effectively removed a quarter of our already small team from the fight, leaving the 3 of us with limited ammunition. Worthy and I had expended much of our supply shooting it out with enemy forces. This was a total shit show. 4 men in disarray with no choices and no time. "Slow down," I called, then, feeling Worthy braking the vehicle, continued, "Riley, 50 meters ahead on the right. Is there a trail on the imagery?" My heart thudded as I waited for his response, my eyes riveted on a barely perceptible break in the trees. "No," Riley answered, and Cancer spoke immediately after. "That's gotta be it, boss." I caught a glimpse of a crude path with tire tracks cutting into the woods, just wide enough to fit a single vehicle. The odds weren't great. It looked like a logging trail, and one that we could have very nearly passed by without noticing. I said, "We're taking it. Kill the lights and transition to NVGs." Worthy extinguished the headlights, and my view of the whitewashed road turned to darkness, re-illuminating in green shadows as I donned my night vision. Worthy wheeled our car into a slow right-hand turn, aligning our tires within the tracks as our car rumbled forward on a bed of dirt and tree roots. Worthy rolled down all 4 windows, and we oriented our weapons into the warm night air. I had no idea whether to expect incoming gunfire or a dead end, both equally plausible. The chanting of frogs and insects poured from the woods, an irritatingly loud symphony that prevented us from discerning any human activity. Shit, I thought. They could have had a full team digging a rocket cache by pickaxe, and we wouldn't hear it until we were virtually on top of them. Riley said, "The river is about 200 meters ahead." "Stop the car," Cancer said as we slowed to a halt. "David, we need to proceed on foot. Look for visual." I said, "You're right. Dismount and we'll parallel the trail." Then I reflexively reached for the door handle until Cancer spoke. "No doors. They'll activate the interior lights." Gritting my teeth, I thought, why not? Let's add another indignity to the growing list that defined our every action since the first time we'd missed killing Bari Khan in our first Syrian ambush. We began clambering out of the open vehicle windows with varying degrees of gracefulness. I managed to pull my upper body outside the car, sitting on the windowsill before adjusting my rifle and sliding my legs out. From the sound of it, Riley was having the toughest time, both on account of his size and having one arm in a sling. Though judging by Cancer's pained grunts, he didn't have a much easier effort with his injured leg. No words were spoken then. Worthy assumed his position as point man and moved into the trees to our right, turning to parallel the trail on its path forward. Cancer fell into the left flank position, and I took the right, with Riley trailing to my right rear as the last man. We moved through the forest in a 4-man fire team wedge, the most fundamental building block of infantry operations. Gone was the notion of any agency status as elite contractors. We were going through motions taught in every military basic training around the world. Our advanced weapons and equipment offset by injuries, our depleted ammo supply, and our complete and total lack of any semblance of a plan. Worthy turned back to me abruptly, pointing to the side of his head, and then shaking it to indicate his comms were down. I transmitted in a whisper, "Radio check." No response, and a quick scan of my teammates mirroring Worthy's hand signal told me that our radios had shit the bed along with everything else. Then Worthy gave another signal, extending an arm to the front. I made out what he was pointing to, but just barely, the slightest hints of glowing light that originated from further down the trail, casting a dim, shifting green glow through the trees. With the extreme amplification under night vision, the real source was probably no more than a flashlight or two, their proximity difficult to determine through the woods. Still, we had no way of knowing who or what we were seeing. They could be enemy or civilians, Riverside 4th of July spectators, or terrorists. There was no time to troubleshoot communications. I waved a hand forward, telling him to continue our patrol. We were going old school, a Vietnam-style foot patrol with the aid of night vision and not much else. At the same time, I was cognizant that my team was following me into hell. Literally, or metaphorically, take your pick. And I felt a deep, surging gratitude, regardless of what was about to occur. I was a foster kid, an orphan with some distant memories of my father, but these 3 men were friends and brothers, along with Ian, though I cringed to credit him at present. He was putting us in a difficult position by notifying Duchess, but his heart was in the right place, and when I asked myself if I'd do anything different in his situation, my mind was silent. Worthy continued slipping through the forest, leading the way until he abruptly took a knee and extended an arm to our left. Scanning the trail beyond the trees, I saw what he was pointing to, a cluster of 5 men on the trail, facing the direction we'd approached from. They were loosely arrayed, though I could tell from their posture that they were all likely armed. I could easily determine from context that this was an enemy observation post, meant to buy time in the event anyone followed the trail to their location.
And that is the end of the beginning of Chapter 62. We've had 60, 61, and 62 from the enemies of my country, and next week we'll finish up Chapter 62. Back in a minute. Thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Caesar's Palace for 12 rounds of boxing. In the red corner, from Los Angeles, California, wearing the red trunks with the gold trim, weighing in at 125 pounds, the lightweight champion of the world, Danny Little Red Lopez. Well, Bill, our winners get a home theater receiver. That's right. Experience the full potential of high-definition video with this 72-channel digital home theater receiver from Yamaha. But wait, that's not all. They also get a 5.1-channel surround sound system from Mirage. With 5 palm-sized speakers and a compact subwoofer cube, the MX 5.1 brings you huge immersive sound with Mirage's omnipolar technology. All from the Spiegel catalog, Chicago, Illinois, 60609. And they're taking closer order as down the stretch they come. Mr. Hot Stuff has 3 lengths to make up with chocolate candy last. On the rail, take the points behind that gallant son with chocolate candy gaining on the outside. In the lead is Pioneer of the Nile being tackled by chocolate candy. They're neck and neck as they come to the wire. And Pioneer of the Nile holds off chocolate candy and wins the Santa Anita Derby. And now, on your feet, time to greet holder of 14 NBA titles, your home team, your Los Angeles Lakers. Number 3 at 6'8", 5th year out of UCLA, playing forward, Trevor Ariza. Starting at center, number 17 at 7 feet, 4th year out of St. Andrews High School, Andrew Bynum. And at guard, number 24, 6'6", 13th season out of Loyal Marion High School, Kobe Bryant.
Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.